Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening for our talk back about the film Mrs. G. We are really delighted to have Pam Hoxter Fine with us to help unpack this film. So for those of you who, many of you know Pam, but for those who don't, I'm going to give you a little bit about her background. Pam Hoxter Fine is a psychotherapist who has been in private practice for 30 years and works with individuals, including adolescents, couples, and families. She's a licensed clinical social worker and trained at a postgraduate program in family therapy. Pam is an active volunteer in the Dallas Jewish community and is currently a board member of the Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas, Akiba Yavna Academies, and serves on the advisory board of the Center for Jewish Education. She has been an instructor in the Florence Melton School in the past, and we're hoping to get her back again. And she is the Dallas coordinator of the March of the Living, and she's helped lead 14 March of the Living trips, which takes students and survivors to Poland and Israel to study the Holocaust. And she has studied the Holocaust extensively. And for all of these credentials, she is the ideal person to help us unpack Mrs. G. So thanks, Pam, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we get started, I want you to please put in the chat box if you have owned a Gottexx bathing suit. Just yes or no. No men need to respond unless you have owned a Gottexx bathing suit, and then you can respond. We were talking to Adina Weinberg, who is a younger member of the staff at JCC, and she admitted to never having heard of Gottexx. So if you're younger and you don't, I understand that. I have lots of, there are a lot of places to start with this movie, and I have to tell you that the more I tried to understand things, the more I went down this gigantic rabbit hole of information about Leah Gottlieb. And so I want to frame this first by starting with trying to understand a little bit about survivors who emigrated to Israel. I'm definitely more familiar with the ones in America. So there's some things that are unique to Israelis. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I learned through a Yad Vashem piece that I found. And the other thing I want to say is there are a lot of contradictions about Leah Gottlieb. And so I was very interested in trying to figure some of those things out, some of which I did and many of which I did not. And some of it is going to be reflected in what I'm going to tell you about here. So this was from like a little webinar that they had about survivors in Israel. And it said, most importantly, they were dedicated to commemoration, to remembering their own families, their communities, and each one of the Holocaust 6 million victims. Survivors became active in two different realms. One, the Israeli realm. Focus was on an unambiguous and intensive fostering of their Israeli identity, striving to shape Israeli culture. And that is clearly something that Leah Gottlieb through Gottexx did, is she very much shaped, she didn't try to shape, she shaped Israeli culture with her business and her style. And we'll talk more about that. But contradiction number one, she didn't speak Hebrew really. I mean, I could understand her Hebrew, which is not a good sign because my Hebrew is not very good. But everything you read says she really didn't understand Hebrew and she didn't really talk in Hebrew. So that's a contradiction. You're supposed to, if survivors threw themselves into Israeli society, one of the ways you would do that is by learning Hebrew, and that was not something that she did. And the other thing was working to preserve the memory of the Holocaust through commemoration and documentation, which is a little bit of what I said earlier. And as far as I could find, there was nothing about that the Gottlieb family did. Very little in commemorating, memorializing. It was interesting to me that I never found a story about the family that hid her and her two little girls, which happened for, I think, several years. And they were hidden in a pit behind somebody's home, and not a word, not a story about that. And I want you to understand that what I'm saying here is not about being judgmental, because I have a very firm belief in not being judgmental about any survivors, about anything they do or say, because I don't know how I would be if I was in their shoes. And it's not a question of being judgmental, it's a question of understanding that Leah Gottlieb really defied stereotypes. And so that was really very interesting to me, that she didn't fit into that mold. She did interesting things, like in her showrooms she served Hungarian food. She didn't serve hummus and falafel, which you might think she would serve, but she served Hungarian food. And she talked in Hungarian a lot, and in lots of different she knew a lot of different languages, but she didn't do so much in Hebrew. um, and I want to talk to you a little bit about trauma as well. So we have to understand trauma, which is a situation where you have very serious and often consistent, very difficult situation that you then have to live with for the rest of your life. And the thing that I came to understand about her is that she didn't have trauma just as a survivor, which she had plenty of, although we don't know very much about it. But she had trauma from the time she was little, because she had a very dysfunctional family. She had a father who was a gambler and an alcoholic, as far as I understand. And she eventually went to live with an aunt. She was mostly raised by an aunt. She lived with her grandmother for a little bit and then an aunt. And that alone is traumatic, not having a solid family to grow up in. And then being faced with war. She was not allowed to go into university because of the laws against allowing Jews into university. And then having these two babies pretty quickly, I think, after she was married, and needing to hide to protect them, and not having her husband with her at that point. So that's all traumatic. And I think that trauma marked a lot of decisions that she made in her life, and created additional contradictions into who she was. I had some questions earlier about how she was, her relationship with her daughters a reflection of herself as her personality, or was it a reflection of the result of her being a survivor? And my guess is that it's about her being a survivor. Of course, we don't know what that personality would have been had she not been a survivor. But I think there are many survivors who had to really cut off from their feelings. They wanted to not look back. And in one of the things I listened to about Leah Gottlieb, it talked about how she was very driven to not look backwards and to always look forward. And that helped drive her decisions. And she was also, as I think we all know, some survivors really threw themselves into their work. And she did that exclusively. She did that to the detriment of her daughters. And when you watch the movie, if you saw how Miriam reacted as she spoke about her mother, it was very painful. And clearly, she did not give her best self as she raised those two girls. Now, she did have them in the work with her, and so she wasn't separated from them in a physical sort of way, but clearly she was not emotionally very connected to them. Although it was also interesting to me in the movie that they showed Miriam that little black and white clip from a Yad Vashem archive, if you recall, and she's describing what it was like to give Miriam up to a Christian family to hide her. And she does this thing where she talks about how she hung on when she got her back after 2 weeks, how the baby Miriam hung on to her so deeply, and she's smiling and has a lot of warmth when she's talking about that. But I kind of think that did not continue for her. And that's just how she became. The other thing that's really interesting that it took me a while to learn about on my trips on March of the Living was that Israelis had the survivors had a hard time assimilating into Israeli culture. Initially, the Israelis were really uncomfortable with them. They didn't know what to make of them. They were foreigners, clearly. And they also had this reputation as sort of the sheep going to slaughter. You remember that phrase and how that would have felt shameful, I think, to the survivors. And it made them, I think, hide their experience. They didn't really want to talk about being survivors. They wanted to survive. And part of surviving was not talking about being a survivor. And it wasn't until years later when the Israeli society as a whole began to accept this group of survivors that they were able to come out and be forthcoming about their experiences. So that's also another layer, as well as the fact that, as you know, there were a lot of survivors who uh, didn't really share their experiences early on. It wasn't until later in their lives that they were able to talk even to their families. I've met families where they learn things about their survivor parent as they themselves are adults, not ever having known about that. And so I think there's marks of all that sort of behavior that we can see in Leah Gottlieb as we look at her as a survivor. And as a businesswoman, she was remarkable. She created this fashion empire that was astounding. The quality of her work was incredible. She took inspiration from so many things around her. She traveled to museums and she looked at art catalogs and she took other fabrics and she was inspired by nature. There's this whole deal about flowers. You notice that flowers are very present in her design. And there's a story that goes, I think they said it in the movie. I'm getting a little confused about whether I saw it elsewhere, if it was in the movie. I think it was in the movie that um, they showed all these daisies appearing around her, and that when she went to different places where she was going to be inspected by a Nazi or some other police person, she would have a bouquet of flowers and she would hide her face in the flowers to hide that she was Jewish. And so her love for flowers is attributed to that. And you saw that when she lived her lavish lifestyle in Israel, they talked about the amount of flowers that she had in her apartment all the time. So this was really important to her and it was repeated in her patterns. She was very involved in everything about creating these swimsuits, from design to how the patterns were cut to who the models were. She really was in control all the way through. And we saw pictures of her snipping away at fabric, even on a model's body, and being amazed that she was willing to do that. But she had such an amazing sense of style that the lines were all reflected in that. And she created immense amount of work. Every year she had a new collection, and there were styles within the collection, and then each style had more styles within it. And sometimes she had between 400 and 600 new suits in a collection annually. So there was a lot of work that she did, and she worked all day long and all night long. And that was what she was driven by. It was really important to her, and she made obviously a huge impact. And the Gotex line became known not as a swimsuit line, but as a high-end fashion line. And that's what she wanted. She herself dressed in high-end fashion, which separated her again from the Israeli culture. When I talked earlier about it, assimilating into Israeli culture, she kept herself apart because of how she dressed and how she saw herself. And the line became very famous. She had, in the highlights of her career, she had these famous models who modeled for her for the swimsuits, as you saw in those beautiful pictures in the film. And she had Elizabeth Taylor wearing her suits and Princess Diana, and it was amazing. It's an amazing thing. And to think that at that point that there was an Israeli item on the market that was so popular and so expensive and glamorous was really an amazing sort of thing. So I think we're going to have Rochelle guide us through some of the questions that we have, and we'll answer any other questions that you have that you put into the chat box. And I really like to be asked questions because I can just respond. And so, Rochelle, where do you want to start?
So, well, you were just speaking about the expensive swimsuits. So at the time that Gotex was making designer swimsuits in the 1960s, were they selling their products in the Israeli market?
They did sell their products in the Israeli market, but for them, it was a very small market. It was not a wealthy country, Israel, and it was a very small market. So they primarily worked on exporting to Europe. And actually, their very first collection was sent to Malta and expanded into Europe. And I think it took a while for it to be more pronounced in Israel.
Okay, thank you. With all her wealth and regal lifestyle, how was she viewed by Israelis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I alluded to it earlier when I said because she dressed in couture herself, it sort of separated her, but she did not assimilate into society. She lived in this tower in Tel Aviv, in this gigantic apartment that was 2 penthouse apartments put together, I believe. And actually, when I came across an obituary for her, it was the same address that she had been in always in Tel Aviv. So she stayed in that apartment. And so it's kind of like being in the ivory tower above everybody else. So she did not really assimilate, even though, again, she clearly impacted Israeli culture and loved Israel. When you look at that part of the runway show of the Jerusalem of Gold, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav line, that's a love of Israel, for sure. I mean, it was beautiful and it was amazing.
Did the actual styles evolve over the years, or was it mostly innovation in fabrics and the way to embellish the basic designs?
I think it was both. The designs were, the fabric themselves were very important to her, as I was talking about the flowers, but there were so many things that inspired her that she added into her fabrics. The Egyptian desert, you saw the Cleopatra kind of look, all the nature, and she picked up a piece of Gauguin artwork and changed it up so that it would work in her fabrics. But the style behind it, not just the fabrics, the workings of the swimsuit was also important. She actually, I believe, what contributed to inventing Lycra, and which I believe is the stuff that holds our stomachs in, if one needs or wants that in their bathing suit, and like who doesn't. But she says that she had a background in chemistry, and she used her background in chemistry to impact how she created the bathing suits and the shaping of the bathing suits, which I found really interesting.
Wow.
And again, she was involved in every part of this, the fabrics, the structure, the design, how it fit. She always had a woman's body in mind, so she knew how to make things drape perfectly. And that's what she did.
Do we know if she was philanthropic? Because there's really no mention of any pet charities or scholarships for design students.
Right. So that was one of the things I really worked hard to find. And I would say that my inability to find anything and the absence of any mention of that indicates that she did not. And so she was really focused on Gotex and moving the line forward. And she was single-minded in that.
Okay.
I actually sent an email to somebody asking who had written an article about her, asking if they knew if she had any philanthropic contributions, and I didn't get an answer back. So it sort of made me think, probably not.
Okay. You talked about her relationships with models. In particular, I think she was really devoted to the model Tammy, and was when Tammy died, she was very, very, very thrown by it. Yet her approach with her children was cold. Do you think that that is part of her survivor persona?
Yeah, I was thinking about that a lot. I think that probably it is a result of who she was as a survivor. It's almost as if she took her daughters for granted. They were there at work with her all the time. They were a fixture in her lives. And Tammy came in as being, she called her muse, which also struck me as interesting. But it's another contradiction about her, because Tammy was not the standard look of beauty in Israel at that time. She was Sephardic, and Sephardim were not really incorporated into Israeli society very comfortably. Israel was very much an Ashkenazic community, and the survivors were primarily Ashkenazim that were public. There were others who were not, but it was really an Ashkenazic sort of influence. And she brought in this woman who looked Sephardic. She had this beautiful skin tone. And after she started dressing Tammy, she started looking for models that had that same skin tone. So that was a really big influence in Israeli culture and in the modeling world. And Tammy became she had not been a famous model, but she became the face of Gotex, and clearly was. And you hear that they describe it as that she could just put on anything, and then they would have the shots done in 3 shots because she was so perfect. So she was her muse, and I'm sure she was devastated when she died. And I don't know why how she died. I didn't.
Cancer.
That. What?
Cancer.
Cancer. Yeah, it wasn't specified really. And we do know that her daughter Judith died of breast cancer, and that was later. That was in 2003. And she had suffered a lot of losses and blows at that point.
There was actually a question about that. Somebody asked, was there something about her daughter Judith's death that sounded mysterious in the movie? You're telling us it was breast cancer.
Yeah, all the research that I did said it was breast cancer. It didn't get a lot of attention in the movie. I don't think it's addressed much.
Okay, and then let's see. Another comment that I'm going to share at the moment from Sissy Zoller, who's on the Film Festival committee. She's saying Film Fest regulars will appreciate that Tammy Ben-Ami was Alcee Perry's girlfriend, and Alcee was 2 movies ago in this winter series. So, yeah.
Thank you, Sissy.
Somebody is asking, they wonder about the trauma of her war experience. Did that cause inability to empathize and relate to her children and to to other people?
Yeah, I mean, again, you could say maybe the lack of scholarships for struggling students and philanthropy is also another sign of that. But yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that I don't think we can understand very well what it must feel like to know you have to go on in your life and compartmentalize your feelings and not really let them out. And I think that that's clearly what she did. And you find that in survivors, many of them are more like that when they're younger, and as they get older, they feel safer with their feelings and they're able to share more. But she really compartmentalized those children. She put them in one place and everything else in another place, and that place was not a warm and fuzzy place.
So somebody else is asking, do we know how her daughter's business is doing?
So that daughter, Miriam, moved to America very early when her mother wanted her to go into the Gotex business. She's tried to not do the Gotex business. She tried to create a lingerie line, and her mother basically put the kibosh on that. She, had put her thumb on it, and it was not going to happen, and she was going to work at Gotex. And so what Miriam said was that she was only going to do that if she could do it from far away. So her own survival skills kicked in, and she moved to America. And she was young, and she was very successful, very, very successful. And she had a lot of connection with the European markets as well. But she was the one who ran the American market and ran the showroom. And one of the things that I read about was that how Saks Fifth Avenue was always the store that had the very first opportunity to bid on her product. And so she had these relationships with Saks and Bloomingdale's, and I think she describes herself as people not being able to say no to her. And she was very successful, but she quit the business in 1999. The business was sold already by then. And I don't know what else she did. I couldn't really find anything. So if anybody else knows anything about that, please put that in the chat box. But I couldn't find if she started any other kind of business, or she said she wanted to really focus on her grandchildren, because she felt like, it sounds like she sort of continued a little bit the pattern of her mother's relationship by not being able to do enough for her own children. So she was going to change that by doing more for her grandchildren, which is also not uncommon in family dynamics. That doesn't have to do necessarily with being a survivor, but repeating family dynamics.
And can you tell us how the documentary came to be?
Yeah, I found that out. That was really interesting. The woman who, it started as a fashion historian who's in the movie, whose name is Karen Ben-Harin, who had this kind of funky haircut, and they refer to her a lot. They quote her. She's on a lot. She was studying fashion history, and she was getting a master's, and she chose Leah Gottlieb to do her thesis on, and that's what happened. And she eventually, with the director, created Mrs. G. So that was really interesting.
Oh. There's another question about the Gotex line, and was it featured in Sports Illustrated? And there's a little conversation going on in the chat between Marshall and Sissy. Apparently it was, but are you aware of that?
Yes, and pictures were in the movie, but the pictures came so rapidly. I watched the movie a couple times to try to sort of parse out what was happening. Mm-hmm. And yeah, Claudia Schiffer was in Sports Illustrated in her bathing suits, and yeah, she was definitely in the Gotex was in the Sports Illustrated swimsuit line. I mean, the swimsuits were gorgeous, and the models were gorgeous. So who said no? She wasn't.
Who said no?
Who said that no, that they didn't think that she was in Sports Illustrated? You don't have to own up.
No, somebody was asking if the swimsuits had been in Sports Illustrated.
Yeah, they had.
So I'm at the end of the questions that I had collected in advance, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot happening out there in the chat. So, but there's, this is an opportunity, folks, to, throw a couple up. Here's one. Laura Fine wants to know. She's saying they were the ultimate bathing suits to own during that time period. Absolutely. I completely agree. They were very expensive, but you had to have one, and it was it was really a source of pride of, for, a Jewish girl to, Jewish woman to have a Gore-Tex swimsuit that was, of the highest fashion and the highest quality that
Quality.
came from Israel. It was,
Yeah, there was so much pride in it being an Israeli product. And I said to Rochelle, it was also, they had it at Loman's sometimes. And that's, that was a Jewish woman's favorite place to go for
yeah,
clothing, Loman's. And if you could get a Gore-Tex bathing suit there, wow,
that
you
was a
won the
deal.
lottery. You won the lottery that day.
So Janice says what she found interesting is that she bled the business into the ground. It could have continued on without all of the waste. Do you want to talk about that, Pam?
Yeah, it's true. And it's so painful. And more articles I read, it was even worse than in the movies, that she wouldn't listen to her financial advisors, as we heard and saw in the movie. And I think it was, I hate to qualify it like this, but I think there was a lot of narcissism involved in that. Like, she was going to make this happen no matter what the facts were. And it was so important to her to be surrounded by luxury and beauty that she couldn't see that the way in which she was doing that was going to be detrimental to the business. And it was really a shame, because you're right. She could have continued in the business. And then her husband died in 1995. And in 1997, she had to sell the business. Now, to her credit, when she was 85 years old, she started her own other line that she could not use the Gore-Tex name. So she used the name Leah. And it was reasonably successful, not in a Gore-Tex sort of way, but it was reasonably successful. But it is really sad, and that's why I was struck by, when I read the obituary, that she actually, the address of where she was when she died was the same address as this ivory tower apartment in Tel Aviv. So even that she didn't give up. I imagine she stopped buying as many flowers, but I don't know. Yeah.
Um, some questions in here about what was the impact of her business on Israeli, um, on Israeli business in terms of, the economy and jobs created.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have really the facts on it, but the impression that I have is um, that she hired, I think at the height, maybe 1,000 people, and that was significant. And she didn't fire people, as we heard. So she was very loyal to her employees, and they were very loyal to her. And I don't know. I think what it did by way of impact on society and fashion is that it showed that you could be an Israeli and have a high style, high end product. And I don't think now that's a surprise at all. But at the time, it was, because everybody was busy trying to create a country and make a life for themselves.
Mrs. G appeared to be the ultimate control freak in her business affairs. Do you think that is an aspect of her having been a survivor?
Yes, I think it's an aspect of her having been a survivor, but I have a feeling it's kind of who she was anyways. I mean, she was totally in control of every aspect of that business. And I myself come from a family that runs a family business, and you can see how it's easy to do that. This is your creation, your baby. You want it to be a certain way, and to trust somebody else to take care of any part of that is very hard. And she clung to every minute of it. What was in the showroom, and as I've said over and over, every single part of the creation of the line she was involved in. You're laughing.
I'm laughing because of something that Lauren put in, that she had a friend who had a lady in Brooklyn who sold the Gore-Tex swimsuits for less money, but she wouldn't share the phone number. So
get some of those old the cover-ups. Oh, they were so beautiful.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll find them here at a vintage store.
The two things that the other product that I remember from the same era coming out of Israel that was incredibly popular with these cotton pajamas for children called Sarah's Prince. I don't know if anybody else. They were also kind of high fashion, and you
Yeah.
could go to Israel and try to find them in Israel, and you really couldn't. They were all imported or
They were all
exported.
they were all at Bloomingdale's. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So,
I
let me
I
see if
don't
there's.
know the timing of that, but
It was it was around the same time.
trying to see what
Oh,
else I have.
somebody wants to know. They tried to find information on the Leah line. Is that still in production?
Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't find anything either on that.
Okay.
I mean, she died in 2012, but it's possible that it's still out there. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. And is Gotex still in production?
I don't know that either. Does anybody know the answer to that?
I only know that the quality went down after she sold the business. Oh, Sissy's saying, Sissy's
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
but I do remember that the quality, it really changed.
Yeah, and it didn't have the panache that her
Mhm.
work did.
Mhm.
I mean, she sacrificed so much in her life to create this business. And I don't think anybody else could have done that. She Everything that she touched had to be perfect. She was not just a controlling person, she was a perfectionist. I don't get the sense that she was mean to people who she thought weren't living up to her standards. I didn't hear that anywhere, which one might think would go along with those other characteristics. But she might have been cold at times, but I don't think she was mean. That's my impression. And I'm going to stick with it.
What was, do you know what her relationship with her husband was like?
Yeah, apparently, which is also interesting given her relationship with her daughters, she apparently adored him. And I mean, there's this whole piece in the movie about her secretary saying, I don't know what he did. He was there, but he never really had anything to do. But he was apparently the financial person. And it was after his death that the business really started to go down. So I would imagine that that's true. But apparently he could walk into the showroom or the factory, and she would light up. And so she had a great love for him.
Okay, and here, there's a couple more, okay, so Jackie Schweitzer is saying she was at Neiman Marcus during the height of Gotex, and it was a huge business. It was everywhere, and it still exists. So there is a 2021 swimwear line. So
Okay.
we can check it out.
Check it out. Please send me an email if you buy one with a picture attached of you in the bathing suit. I really loved that. I think all of her work was beautiful, but I think it was the Jerusalem of Gold line and the runway in Germany was amazing. I mean, that pushes all my buttons. So it was beautiful. My parents both were from Germany. It was really an astounding thing.
Okay, so any other questions, folks? Thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Michelle, for asking me. This was so much fun, and I really enjoyed understanding more about her as a character and watching the movie, and it was a wonderful process for me.
So, you know, the last program we did together was a book, not a movie, and you helped us to interview. Now I'm going to blank on his name, but he was also in the garment business, and he was a suit maker.
Martin Greenfield.
Martin Greenfield, yes.
Who did suits for presidents. He manufactured suits for presidents, and he was a survivor. Yes. So what do you think, Rochelle, if you had to compare the two of them, he was definitely a super warm guy. He
Oh, yes.
sent me this
So,
present after the program and with a note and please come visit me in New York.
right.
And he was very sweet
Yeah,
and
there,
very successful.
yes, but I think, um, he was a custom haberdasher,
Mhm.
and he really, like, could get inside the psyche of the person that he was dressing, and that's how he described it when he talked to us. That he was dressing these people, and she was creating art
Yeah.
for the perfect body. Uh, that it
But
worked
you know,
okay.
she would disagree with that. They've said in everything that I've read that she created for all bodies. It's a little hard to imagine when you look at Tammy Ben-Ami, but
Mhm.
that's what she said. That there was
Okay.
a lot hidden under those folds, and that
Mm.
said at some point they're kind of like their best friend were the people who were in the corset business. So I found that pretty interesting. Doesn't sound very comfortable to me, but
No, but it probably worked.
yeah, yeah.
But it is interesting that both of these survivors were in some aspect of the high-end garment trade.
Yeah. Again, people who really wanted to have um, an impact and use their lives to have purpose. I mean, and purpose is defined by the person. I mean, her purpose was her business and to create beauty. And when you said she created art, that's 100% correct. It's a great way to describe it because she did. She borrowed art and she used it, and it was impressive. And Martin Greenfield was all about quality, and he made these presidents look amazing.
Um, Chabad sought 10% of Leah Gottlieb's estate, claiming that she promised it in her will.
Yeah,
And apparently she mentioned them in an earlier will and then changed it. And
not in the second will.
right. And then somebody's wondering about her feelings about Judaism.
Yeah, also hard to find. I mean, I really looked through a lot of things. There was an exhibit of her work of Gottex's at the museum in Cologne, and I looked through that too. And really, the only sense that you have about her Judaism was in her work was the Jerusalem of Gold line, but there was some talk about that she was grounded in lighting Shabbat candles, and that she was raised with. I mean, she was in Hungary. She was raised with basic Jewish life, and I think that she can continue that. I don't imagine that she was a secular Israeli, nor was she particularly observant, but I think that she was very Jewish in her soul.
Okay. Just making sure that we're capturing all of the last few comments. Yeah, apparently she was a continuing donor to Chabad during her lifetime.
That's
But
interesting. So that says a lot. So there's her philanthropy. I
mhm.
wonder how much she contributed. Um, Adina, how many people said yes, they had a bathing suit, a Gotex bathing suit? Can you tell? I mean, that was 45 minutes ago, but
Maybe just under 10.
Oh,
okay. Well, Rochelle had one.
definitely.
I had one.
Brenda had one.
Okay.
Brenda still has one. So.
Yeah, I got mine at Loman, so I have to admit. Anything else? Anybody want to talk about March of the Living? Oh, somebody said two.
Why don't you tell us a little bit? Is March of the Living happening this year?
March of the Living is unfortunately not happening this year. This will be the second year in a long history of annual March of the Livings that is not happening. And this year it feels not as bad as last year. Last year was devastating because it was in April and we had just started the pandemic and the kids were all geared up and they had already started their classes. We do classes before they go on Holocaust education. And we can't recreate it. Even if we could take them to the museum in Washington, it doesn't recreate what happens on March of the Living, where on the day of what is called the march, the kids walk from Auschwitz to Birkenau, which is only 1.5 miles, but it's a very beautiful, amazing sight because everybody's wearing these little blue jackets, and there's just a mass of people. There's been anywhere from 12 to 18,000, maybe 20,000 at the height. And the ability to be exposed to survivors, losing 2 years of that is very sad.
Yeah.
Because they're just getting older and it's a hard trip.
Hopefully 2022.
They're planning on it. But one of the things that they did last year, 3 years ago, was that they started, and this was through the Shoah Foundation, doing holographic figures of survivors that could be used at places. So like the one that's down at our museum, Max was involved in holographic filming in front of different places like the barrack in Majdanek and several other places. And so we'll see if that does something. I mean, it's some way to keep survivors there when they can no longer be there.
Carolyn asked a question about, there was a brief clip of an interview of Leah Gottlieb at Yad Vashem.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's asking if there is anything more that, hang on, I want to get this.
I couldn't find it. I went to every section of Yad Vashem to try to find that video. So maybe I didn't do enough or do it correctly, but I couldn't find anything else. But that one, I mean, look, her daughter hadn't seen that. Her daughter was crying while she was watching that. She was going, oh my God, she hadn't seen it.
And then Deborah's saying that the story of Leah Gottlieb was really sad. And her question is basically, did other survivors operate in the same way emotionally, sublimating their horrific experiences to make beauty?
I would think they did. I can't really tell you, like a percentage of them, but the example we gave was Martin Greenfield, who also did that. Again, just my sense about survivors is that each person is very unique. There are certain traits that we could say are similar across survivors, but in general, how people respond is very unique, and we can't really judge it. And some of them are incredibly loving, amazing parents and grandparents, and others are more hidden and remained silent throughout their lives, and that was very painful for their children as they grew up. But they still, I mean, as Miriam says in the movie, she has great respect for her mother. I would love to know more about her children and what they've done, but they're pretty discreet. They were not all over social media. Let me put it to you that way.
Okay. Well, thanks again for spending some time with us, for spending the time researching Leah Gottlieb and the film, and for helping us to get a little bit more of a window into who she was and into Gottech swimsuits.
Yeah. Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you, Rochelle, and to everybody, and I hope that it was interesting for you.
Okay.
Okay.
So we hope to see all of you 2 weeks from now, when we are actually a little less than 2 weeks from now. We have a bye week next week, but the next movie is stars Judi Dench, and it is a Texas premiere, and we're really fortunate to have this, the opportunity to watch this film together before it makes its theatrical debut. It's called 6 Minutes to Midnight. And we'll be unpacking that in conversation with Dr. David Patterson and Dr. Nils Romer from the Ackerman Center.
That'd be great. And I'll just make a sidebar recommendation for the community read, because they just finished reading that book, Hannah's War, and it's great.
Great book.
So get your hands on that. And it's going to be that's going to be great.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Good night.
Night.